All right, everyone, time to talk a little bit about the Italian election, how it was called a bellwether for months by even people who like the European Union. They're like, oh, this is basically a bellwether for Euroscepticism within Europe. You know, Italy, it's not exactly like a Hungary. It hasn't been abused quite as much as parts of Eastern Europe by Merkel. So we're going to look at this situation where primarily the migrant problem there is aquatic in nature, and like migrants move through Italy to get to, richer parts of Europe, to get to Germany or Sweden or wherever. So we're going to look at this sort of this middle of the road country. It's marginally developed mostly, but there are underdeveloped areas. It's better off than, half of Europe, but worse off than half of Europe. And it kind of sort of has a migrant crisis, but not as much as, parts of Germany or something. So we're going to look at this, at their election, and see a bellwether of what's to come. And lo and behold, populism and nativism wins the day, and you've got split government. But between the two main populist parties within Italy, yeah, they got about half of the, a little bit more than half of the support. Okay, there's your bellwether. The European experiment has totally failed. Huzzah! See, that's great for Europeans. I love it when people who are Europhiles, they say, well, without the European Union, Europe would be weaker. Well, number one, I'm not sure if that's true. Number two, you're talking about strength as in, hey, the governments of Europe have power. I should say the Western European governments have power. You're talking about them having power, them having wealth. You're not talking about the average European. You're not talking about the average German citizen, the average Italian or Polish citizen. You're not talking about the average French person or Spaniard. You're talking about people, literally, and in the 1%, it's a corporate experiment of sorts. That's what the European Union hilariously is. You managed to convince people that the welfare crumbs you were going to hand out to them would improve their lives. Instead, you give brain drain to the less well-off countries, while causing social unrest in the more well-off countries. Now, that little bit of unrest you already had wouldn't have sunk the European experiment. You got different financial situations between maybe an Italy and a Germany, between Sweden and Hungary. Certainly, there are economic differences, there are social differences, religious differences. That alone wouldn't have been enough. But then people woke up one day and realized that there were millions and millions of people who were not actually from Europe in Europe that also had free movement and could work and do whatever else they wanted. And that if one European country, like say Merkel wants to import people, nobody else can stand in their way. They can build a fence, but they can't do anything once they come across the fence. They can't do anything about it because of the European Human Rights Commission and things like that. So they can't even stop the movement of people into Europe. There's no way to do it. There's no legal recourse for other people who are like, well, what the fuck's happening? We're being overrun. There are people here, they're just sort of, itinerant within our nation. They're just sort of, they're migratory but not migrating. What's happening here? They're not from Europe. We thought that the European Union would have free movement within Europe, beneficial to the European people. It's the European experiment to stop war and stuff. By the way, Europe isn't going to fall into civil war because the European Union dissolves. And to say that Russia won the Italian election, oh, bullshit, come on. You said that in France, you said this in the UK, you said it over here in the US. Russia is not behind every bit of political change happening in the Western world. You are nuts. I'm sure that Russia would prefer a European Union, because the European Union at the end of the day is fucking stupid. The European Union at the end of the day isn't going to be able to respond to Russia in a military fashion. No, some of the European nations, spurred on by the United States, have increased defense spending. Trump comes in, and by the way, someone who Merkel really, really hates, won't even talk to. He's like, yeah, you're going to, these other NATO countries, basically the European Union in large part, you're going to have to pay more. You need to beef up your own militaries. We can't do it alone. We got the world's most powerful military. We expect you to do something. And some members begrudgingly did so. Others were already above the threshold, thankfully. Then we hear the report that most of Germany's tanks and stuff don't even function. Okay, that grand glorious European Union, decades later, you would expect that things would be better off in Europe. Instead, they're falling into infighting. If Russia wanted chaos, you'd keep the European Union. You'd keep people like Merkel and people in Brussels alienating other countries, potentially driving them closer to Russia, by the way. You're alienating Eastern Europe. The worst nightmare of all of NATO would be Eastern Europe gets tired of Merkel enough, so they start talking to Putin. Big buddy USA has to come in and talk to them because Merkel can't. We have to talk to these countries. We have to do. Once again, the United States, the boogeyman of Western Europe, all those evil, butcherous, imperialistic Americans. Now we have to save you once again from yourselves because you keep dealing with Brussels. So when I look at the Italian election, or I look at France, where more than a third of the population voted for populism and nativism, that's a far cry, far well and beyond what it had before. Doesn't matter if Le Pen loses the election. She still majorly increased support for that movement. I think it had been a quarter before. So, election over election, almost 10% more support. 10 points more support. That's pretty significant. Give it another election or two, and then populism will take France as well. By the way, you've got another problem. French politicians seem to be competing with German politicians as who's going to lead the European Union. You've got the French model, which is slightly kinder and gentler, a little bit more benevolent. It's geared more towards sipping some wine instead of getting drunk and then punching people, maybe. Angela Merkel's nuts. She still thinks she can rule all of Europe like an emperor or a Führer or something. That's what she wants. It's a German experiment. I think 30, 40 years ago, people would have gotten nervous about such a thing. They looked the other way and said, oh, it sounds like a good idea. Now they talk about Turkey entering the European Union, for example. Turkey, with 4 or 5 million people who have migrated into Turkey from Syria and places south. Okay, that sounds like a free movement. That's a good idea. As though there isn't already basically free movement because of Germany's existence anyway in regards to Turkey. And it's not a problem. The problem is really mass migration from elsewhere. The problem is that because of Western dick-wagging imperialistic foreign policy, they keep destabilizing countries and then taking refugees from them, leading to attacks, leading to all sorts of social unrest. The rise of the so-called far right isn't because of Russia. It's because people are getting tired of the way Europe functions. Just like the rise of the so-called far right here, which is like MAGA populism, is even more watered down than Southern European populism, by the way, just so everyone knows. The rise of the MAGA stuff here is because people saw in America in decline. They see a United States that's beginning to take a back seat in world affairs, that's no longer as strong as it used to be, that no longer is as geared towards caring about actual Americans as it used to be. That has nothing to do with Russia. Russia could not exist and it still would have happened. It still would have happened. In fact, Russia being stronger is a cement, a glue for the Western nations under the umbrella of NATO and the European Union. The boogeyman of the Soviet Union held us together. It kept things more peaceful and more prosperous ultimately in the Western world, the fact that there was a main adversary. I think almost that they're trying to drum up Russia as a big threat, even though it's not, just to extend the Cold War a little bit longer to keep the growth going. Almost like it's an economic strategy or something. Yeah, the free movement of people, hell, 4.5 million. It's going to be a fun time. Now, you see, the problem is when that happens, half of Europe will leave the European Union. Some of those people will end up being allies of Russia. And just so you know, now if you think Russia wants to win the grand chessboard and get Eastern Europe back, best way to do it is keep the European experiment going as it is. Refuse reform, don't weaken it at all, don't give any concessions to the Eastern European or Southern European member states. Keep it just a German-centric alliance. You're talking about wanting a European military. Germany can't even run its own military. Your own military has fallen to pieces. It's not being maintained properly. You're too busy paying welfare. It's not going to happen. Europe will never be the world power in our lifetimes again. There may come a day, centuries from now, where Europe regains its relevance. It goes full imperialism again or something. You could do that, by the way, at any time. The more prosperous, especially nuclear European nations, could totally ignore world convention. They've got all sorts of precedents and the capability to do so. They could carve up the world again if they really wanted to. The United States isn't going to do anything. Who's going to do something? Russia? They're not going to get involved. They don't give a fuck. China? They're not going to care. They're not going to care. China's doing the same thing right now. China's now a colonial power. They're colonizing parts of Central America, in certainly Nicaragua. They're developing things there. They're going to military base. Eastern Africa. I think Djibouti actually is hosting a foreign Chinese base now, if I remember correctly. I think they installed that a couple years ago. No, you're sitting there worried about Russia that can't do shit. And you're worried about evil imperialistic US, and you're worried about populism. Oh no, somebody might want national sovereignty within Europe. That's a terrible thing, because Europe is opposed to national sovereignty. Meanwhile, you're ignoring the actual rising threats in the world. You're ignoring the problem of the far left. The neo-communism, you could call it. It's in a different, more technological form now. You're ignoring the problem of Chinese expansionism. You're ignoring everything else, and then you expect to strangulate the United States, the only country trying to stop these things. Okay, what a wonderful idea. Keep it up, see what happens. It'll collapse Europe. You know, we don't have to, here in the United States, be worried about Europe competing with us. They won't be competing for very long. European, countries are meaningless. But the thing is, you're our allies, so we actually give a damn. So when I look over and I see, post-nationalism, internationalism, and globalism rising up in Europe to try to throttle sovereign movements, when I see the abuse of people in Europe, and this affects me online too. The European countries are constantly trying to get Google and Facebook and all these others to censor material more quickly and in a more draconian manner. When I see this happening, I feel sorry for you, and also I worry about our own future over here. I don't want to be abused by European censorship. But the populists there probably don't want to censor the kind of material that I'm inclined to make. They're not going to do that, so who cares? So yeah, I hope that the populists take over all of Europe. I hope they dismantle the European Union. It would be the best thing for all European people, except for a handful of bureaucrats and politicians. That's about all. Peace out.